But let's move on. That's one internal problem. Let's look at another problem. This particular problem concerns Muhammad. Who was Muhammad? Was he a prophet of God? How do we know? We'll be talking about that issue in the coming months. But one issue I want to point to today is, and it has to do with another internal inconsistency within Islam, has to do with the idea that Muhammad brought the Quran, and therefore we know, number one, that Muhammad was a prophet, and number two, the Quran is the word of God. How? Why? What's the Muslim argument to this? It's this. Muhammad was an illiterate man. We find this idea in Surah 7, chapter 7 of the Quran, verse 157 and 158. Islam, the Quran talks about Muhammad being the unlettered prophet. The unlettered prophet. That term, they say, unlettered prophet, means that Muhammad could neither read nor write. And so, as an unlettered prophet, as an illiterate man, the fact that the Quran came through him, through the angel Gabriel, to Muhammad, Muhammad was able to produce the Quran, this glorious piece of literature, even though he was an illiterate man, attests to the fact that, number one, Muhammad was a prophet of God. That was his sole miracle. The fact that the Quran even came about through Muhammad is a miracle in itself. And number two, it attests to the fact that the Quran must be the Word of God. Because an illiterate man, an unlettered man, could not have produced this magnificent piece of literature. So let's look at that for a moment. Let's tear that idea apart. Let's consider some other things we find. And let's think about this critically. Number one, if Muhammad was illiterate, then, number one, why did his wife Khadijah, his very first wife Khadijah, hire Muhammad as her business manager? Now we know when we read the traditions, when we read Muhammad's biography, when we read the history of Al-Tabari, we find out that Khadijah was a very wealthy woman. She was 40 years old when she met Muhammad. He was 25. So Muhammad was 15 years younger than Khadijah. Khadijah was a very wealthy woman. She had a very prosperous trading business back and forth between the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and up into Syria and back. And she hired Muhammad because supposedly he was known to be very honest, a good man. And so she hired him to be her business manager. Now, why in the world would Khadijah hire this very knowledgeable, the very intelligent businesswoman? Why would she hire somebody to be a business manager if this person could neither read nor write? You would think a business manager would somehow have to keep track of business transactions and of necessity would need to write down those business transactions that occurred. But let's move on from that. That's almost irrelevant anyway, because the point that Muhammad, the idea that Muhammad was illiterate and therefore he produced the Quran is irrelevant anyway. When we studied the Quran and how the Quran came to be, we find that Muhammad did not write the Quran. In fact, if you ask any Muslim, who wrote the Quran? Did Muhammad write the Quran? The answer will be vehemently no. Muhammad did not write the Quran. It was written down by the Sahaba, by those who were Muhammad's close companions as he began receiving revelations. And so the fact that Muhammad was illiterate is irrelevant altogether as to how the Quran came to be. What miracle is there that an illiterate man did not write a book? You see the problem here. Muhammad was illiterate. Well, did he write the Quran? No. So what's the point? Where's the miracle that an illiterate man did not write a book? It doesn't make sense. It's incomprehensible. But even beyond that, when we look at the traditions, when we look at the hadith of Muhammad, the recorded deeds and sayings of Muhammad, we find actually evidence in the hadith traditions that Muhammad did in fact read. He could read and he could write. For example, in Sahih al-Bukhari, the most revered collection of hadith traditions, things that Muhammad said and did. In Bukhari, volume 1, book 3, hadith number 65, we find the following words. It says, once the Prophet wrote a letter. Well, what in the world is Muhammad doing writing a letter if he's illiterate, if he can neither read nor write? Is that inconsistent? Absolutely it is. Again, in Bukhari, volume 7, book 62, number 88, we find the following narration. It says, the Prophet wrote the marriage contract with Aisha when she was 6 years old. Who wrote the marriage contract? The Prophet, Muhammad himself, wrote the marriage contract with Aisha. Again, in Sahih al-Bukhari, book 1, or volume 1, book 3, hadith number 114. This is talking about when Muhammad was close to death. He was nearing the end of his life. And he knew he was dying. And he asked for his followers to bring him something to write his final instructions on. In volume 1, book 3, number 114, we find the following. It says, when the ailment of the prophet became worse, he said, bring for me writing paper, and I will write for you a statement, after which you will not go astray. So how in the world is this illiterate prophet, this illiterate man, asking his close companions, those who were around him, surrounding him on his deathbed, to bring him something to write on, to write the final instructions for his followers, so that they would not be led astray after his death? How could he be writing his final instructions if he could not write at all? And so you see there's a problem for Islam. There's an internal inconsistency. We're going to be discovering many of these internal inconsistencies over the coming weeks and months. Now, Muslims will say, well, hold on. You Christians have nothing to gripe about. The Bible is full of internal inconsistencies and contradictions as well. I'll challenge any Muslim to point out any of those for me. All the ones that Muslims have pointed out in the past, they've all been answered before. They're very easy. The majority of them have to do with simple scribal errors that occurred during the transcription of the various manuscripts as they were handed down from one generation to the next. They were copied by scribes as generations proceeded, and every now and then a scribe would make an error. Usually a marking concerning the numbers, a number of something, number of Solomon's horses, number of Solomon's stables, and so forth. So there are minor inconsistencies of those types. But it doesn't matter. Those have all been answered. For you Christians that are watching this video, I want to point you to a couple of resources that you can use where you can find all these objections already answered. Here's one of them. The Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties by Gleason Archer. Informed answers to your most troublesome questions. Very good resource. Just about every contradiction you'll find Muslims raising against the Bible are answered in this book. Here's another one. Hard Sayings of the Bible by Walter Kaiser, Peter Davids, F.F. Bruce, and Manfred Brock. Hard Sayings of the Bible. Again, inconsistencies, at least perceived inconsistencies in the Bible, perceived contradictions that have been answered. Indisputable. When Skeptics Ask by Norm Geisler and Ron Brooks. Another very great resource, and again, a companion book to that one, When Critics Ask. Again, by Norm Geisler and Thomas Howe. So we have many resources available to us to help us understand what these objections are that not only Muslims raise, but skeptics, agnostics, atheists, and so forth. They've all been answered. Christianity has stood the test of time. The Bible has stood the test of time. The Bible has withstood every attack that has come against it in terms of historical accuracy, archaeological accuracy, scientific accuracy. We're going to be applying some of these criteria to the Quran over the next weeks and months. But I just pointed out a couple to you. Internal inconsistencies within the Quran, within Islamic theology. Muslims have much to answer for. Come home. Come back to the real truth. Come back to the truth of the Bible. The Bible has never been found to be incorrect. The Bible has never been found to be corrupt. The Bible has always been found to be 100% accurate. You cannot say that about the Quran. Come home to the Bible. Come home to Jesus.